You won't believe what Joyce Meyer just exposed about Joni Lamb. In a shocking twist that's shaking the Christian world, Joyce drops a truth bomb that leaves Daystar reeling and Joni out. Betrayal, hidden secrets, and a jaw-dropping revelation that changes everything you thought you knew about Daystar's perfect image. Is this the end for Joni Lamb? Stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. For years, Joni Lamb's image was that of a faithful, smiling leader, guiding Daystar with grace while spreading messages of hope to millions of viewers. People saw her on stage, praising God and encouraging families to stay strong, and many believed she was exactly who she appeared to be. But behind the lights and camera smiles, things were changing in ways no one could see on screen. Inside the offices of Daystar, whispers started to grow. Staff noticed how Joni was becoming more controlling, insisting on making every decision, even small ones, without listening to advice. Employees who had once felt like family now felt nervous around her, afraid to speak up or offer ideas. Some said that if you didn't agree with Joni, you would quietly be moved to a different role or pushed out altogether. It was a slow change, but it was clear something was shifting. At home, things were also getting tense. Her son Jonathan, who once stood proudly beside her, began to pull away. He had always believed in the mission of Daystar, but he started to feel like he was just another worker, not a valued part of the family. They argued more often, and Jonathan found himself stepping back from public appearances, leaving people to wonder where he had gone. Friends close to the family noticed the tension, and the once warm relationship between mother and son was becoming strained. People at church events began to whisper, wondering why Joni seemed distant or frustrated. She was still smiling, but those who looked closely saw how forced it sometimes appeared. Supporters who had always seen her as a caring leader started to feel confused as they heard stories of how staff felt pressured and how meetings were no longer about God's vision, but about maintaining Joni's control. Meanwhile, outside of Daystar, rumors started to grow louder. Some said Joni was more focused on building her brand than building God's kingdom, that her ambition was taking priority over faith and humility. Others felt she was using Daystar to keep herself in the spotlight rather than focusing on the network's true mission. Donors and partners began to feel uneasy, unsure if their support was still going toward a mission they believed in. The image of Joni Lamb as the perfect Christian leader was cracking, and those cracks were getting harder to hide. Viewers still saw the polished broadcasts and faith-filled speeches, but inside Daystar, the people who worked closest to her were seeing the pressure, the arguments, and the fear of speaking up. The tension between the public image and the private reality was growing, and even Joni could feel it. She knew people were starting to notice, but she didn't know how to stop the slow unraveling that was taking place around her. As the days passed, Joni's control tightened even more, and those who once trusted her leadership began to question if the mission of Daystar was still about faith or if it had become about protecting Joni's image. The cracks in the perfect picture were no longer just whispers. They were becoming visible to everyone, and the world was about to learn that the face they saw on TV was not the full story. For years, Joyce Meyer and Joni Lamb stood together on stages, prayed together behind closed doors, and supported each other as leaders in Christian media. Many people saw them as a powerful team, sharing God's word with millions and showing what faith and friendship could look like. But what people didn't know was that behind the scenes, Joyce had been watching Joni change, and what she saw worried her deeply. Joyce is known for her strong, direct way of speaking, but she is also careful about when to speak up. For a long time, she chose to stay quiet, hoping things would change on their own. She had seen Joni become more controlling at Daystar, taking over every detail and pushing aside people who tried to question her. Joyce noticed how the focus seemed to shift from serving God to protecting Joni's image and keeping her in control, and it broke Joyce's heart to watch it happen. She tried to have private conversations with Joni. She would call her late at night, hoping to reach the friend she once knew, and remind her of why they started their ministries in the first place. They were supposed to be helping people, spreading faith, and living humbly before God. But each time Joyce tried, she felt like Joni wasn't really listening anymore. Instead, Joni would change the topic, or promise to think about it, but nothing ever changed. Ever since Joni was working with the order, she said. Meanwhile, Joyce heard from people working inside Daystar who were afraid to speak out. They shared stories about being pushed out for disagreeing with Joni, about meetings where fear replaced faith, and about how Joni's need to control everything was draining the ministry of its original purpose. Joyce listened quietly, taking in each story, each tearful phone call, and each plea for help. Over time, Joyce realized that staying quiet was no longer helping. She began to feel that God was pressing on her heart to speak the truth, even if it meant risking her friendship with Joni and facing backlash from people who wouldn't understand. She prayed about it for weeks, asking God for wisdom and courage, because she knew once she spoke, there would be no turning back. Then came the day Joyce decided it was time. She stood in front of a small group, her Bible in hand, her voice calm but strong, and she began to share what she had been holding inside for so long. Joyce said she had watched Joni drift away from the mission they both cared about, turning Daystar into something that served Joni's goals more than God's. She talked about how power and control had taken over faith and humility, and how it hurt to see a friend lose sight of what truly mattered. Joyce's words were clear, not filled with anger, but with a deep sadness and disappointment. "I have loved Joni like a sister," she said, "but I cannot stay quiet when I see God's work being turned into a personal stage." She explained that leadership in God's kingdom is not about holding on to power, but about serving others with humility and love, and she believed Joni had lost that perspective. The moment Joyce spoke out, it felt like the entire Christian community took a deep breath. Some were shocked, unable to believe that Joyce would speak against Joni. Others felt relief, finally understanding the tension they had sensed for a long time. People who had felt ignored or pushed aside by Joni's leadership now felt seen and heard. Joni's supporters quickly came to her defense, saying Joyce was mistaken and didn't understand the full story. They said Joyce was turning a personal disagreement into a public spectacle. But Joyce stood firm. She knew this wasn't about personal drama. It was about protecting the heart of ministry and calling out a friend who was losing her way. As Joyce's words spread, more stories came to light. Former employees and people who had worked with Daystar shared how they had felt the culture changed under Joni's leadership. They talked about how fear replaced faith, and how decisions seemed more about protecting Joni's position than following God's plan. Joyce's courage gave them the strength to speak up too. Joyce felt the weight of her decision every day after speaking out. It wasn't easy for her to go against someone she once called a close friend, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She continued to pray for Joni, hoping that this moment of truth would help her see what needed to change, not just for the sake of Daystar, but for Joni's own heart and relationship with God. Joyce's decision to break her silence became a turning point. It opened the door for necessary conversations within the church about accountability, power, and the true purpose of ministry. It reminded people that no leader is above correction, and that loving someone sometimes means telling them the truth, even when it hurts. As Joyce continued her ministry, she remained clear that her goal was not to destroy Joni or Daystar, but to protect the mission they had both once shared. She wanted to see Daystar return to its purpose of spreading faith and hope, not fear and control. Joyce's voice became a light in a confusing time, showing what it means to lead with integrity and courage, even when it costs you deeply. In the end, Joyce's decision to speak up was not just about Joni. It was about reminding the Christian community that faith must come before fame, that humility must come before power, and that even leaders need to be held accountable to the calling they claim to serve. It was a moment that would change everything, and the echoes of Joyce's brave words would be felt across ministries for years to come. When Joyce Meyer broke her silence, the ripple was felt immediately inside Daystar's walls. What was once whispered in corners was now out in the open, and there was no way to put the truth back into hiding. People who had worked there for years started to feel the tension grow, and even those who tried to stay neutral could see that everything was about to change. Inside the Daystar offices, staff members felt torn. Some had always admired Joni Lamb, seeing her as a strong leader who carried the network forward after Marcus Lamb's passing. They remembered her prayers before meetings, her focus during long planning sessions, and how she would encourage them to keep faith at the center of everything they did. But as Joyce's words spread, some employees started to think back to moments that had never felt quite right. The fear in meetings when someone questioned Joni's decisions, the way staff would exchange glances but stay silent, and the way Joni seemed to care more about control than collaboration. For many, the hardest part was the confusion. They loved the mission of Daystar, they believed in the power of Christian media, and wanted to see lives changed through faith-filled programming. But now, They wondered if what they were working for was becoming more about protecting Joni's image than serving God's people. Viewers began to notice changes too. Emails started to pour in from people who had watched Daystar for years, asking what was happening and if the rumors were true. Some viewers were angry at Joyce, saying she was causing division in the body of Christ. Others thanked her, saying they had sensed something wrong for a long time but didn't know how to speak up. The comments on social media were a mixture of prayers, confusion, and calls for answers. Ministry partners who had supported Daystar financially began to ask questions. They wanted to know if their donations were still going towards spreading the gospel, or if they were being used to maintain a leader's power. Some ministries decided to pause their partnerships, waiting to see how Daystar would respond to the allegations. Others quietly began looking for new networks to work with, afraid that continuing their relationship with Daystar would harm their own reputations. Inside the Lamb family, the stress was heavy. Joni's children, who had always been a part of the ministry, were put in a difficult position. Some supported their mother fully, believing that Joyce had misunderstood the situation. Others felt the strain, wondering if Joyce's words were a wake-up call. Jonathan Lamb, who had worked closely with his mother, found himself caught between loyalty to his family and the growing concerns of the staff and supporters who wanted transparency. Board meetings at Daystar became tense. Questions were asked that had never been asked before. People wanted to know how decisions were being made, how money was being spent, and why Joni was refusing to address some of the concerns directly. Some board members pushed for audits and accountability, while others defended Joni, arguing that this was a spiritual attack meant to destroy the ministry's impact. The fallout wasn't just about public perception, it affected the day-to-day atmosphere. Staff who once felt secure now wondered if they would lose their jobs for speaking up. Volunteers who had served faithfully started to withdraw, not wanting to be part of a ministry that was under fire. Interns who had come to Daystar to learn about Christian media found themselves in the middle of a storm they didn't understand. Through it all, Joni Lamb tried to hold her ground. She released statements saying Daystar was still committed to God's work and that the accusations were unfair. She appeared on broadcasts with her usual confidence, praying and preaching as she always had. But viewers noticed the tension in her eyes and the careful way she chose her words. It was clear that the weight of the allegations was heavy on her, even as she tried to carry on with business as usual. Some of Daystar's most loyal viewers felt conflicted. They didn't want to believe that the woman they had trusted for years could have lost sight of the mission. They had watched her walk through grief when Marcus died, had prayed with her during broadcasts, and felt connected to her journey. To them, Joyce's words felt like a betrayal. But deep down, they couldn't ignore the questions that were rising. As the days turned into weeks, the tension only grew. Media outlets picked up the story, and what had started as a faith community issue became a topic in Christian news circles. Articles were written, podcasts discussed the situation, and church leaders began to share their own thoughts on what accountability should look like for Christian leaders. Daystar's donations began to slow down. Some viewers chose to stop giving until they could see changes in leadership and transparency about finances. Others pulled their support completely, saying they could no longer trust the ministry until it was clear that God's mission was being prioritized over personal ambition. Staff meetings became places where people spoke in hushed tones, trying to figure out what would happen next. Rumors about Joni stepping down began to circulate, while others said she would never leave the ministry she helped build. Some employees quietly packed their desks, leaving notes for their friends, saying they couldn't stay any longer in a place that felt divided. In churches across the country, pastors referenced the situation as a reminder that even faith leaders are human and need accountability. Small groups prayed for Daystar, asking God to heal what was broken and to bring truth to light. For many believers, the fallout was a painful reminder that the church is not about personalities, but about Christ. The fallout hitting Daystar was not just a story of scandal, it was a moment of reckoning. It forced people to look closely at what it means to lead with integrity and to ask hard questions about the ministries they support. It showed that even the biggest platforms can crumble if the foundation shifts from faith to personal ambition. Daystar stood at a crossroads, with the choices made in the days to come deciding whether the ministry would recover and return to its mission or continue to fracture under the weight of the fallout. And in homes around the world, viewers waited, prayed, and watched, hoping that the truth would lead to restoration, not destruction. Joni Lamb sat alone in her office late one night, staring at the quiet hum of the Daystar building. The screens that once brought her joy, showing live worship and teaching from around the world, now felt like silent witnesses to the chaos swirling around her life. For years, Joni had been the face of Daystar, holding the ministry together after Marcus passed, appearing on broadcasts with faith and hope, telling viewers that God still had a plan, no matter the storm. But now, it was her storm, and she wasn't sure how to lead through it. The fallout from Joyce Meyer's statements shook everything Joni had built. Donations slowed, staff were whispering in the hallways, and ministries were quietly stepping back from partnerships with Daystar, unsure of what was really happening. Joni tried to keep the broadcasts going, showing her usual confident faith on camera, but the cameras couldn't hide the tension in her voice or the exhaustion in her eyes. She was trying to pray, to believe that God could fix this, but she couldn't silence the doubts that kept waking her up at night. Inside the Daystar offices, the environment changed. Meetings that used to be filled with laughter and planning for new projects turned into tense discussions about finances, declining viewership, and the growing public doubt. Some of the staff still supported Joni completely, believing she was under spiritual attack, that Joyce's words were unfair, and that Joni was being misunderstood. Others, however, started to question if the ministry had shifted too far toward protecting Joni's image instead of focusing on the mission of spreading the gospel. But Joni felt the weight of every look, every hesitant question from her team, and every email from viewers asking what was really going on. She remembered the early days with Marcus, praying together, dreaming about reaching the nations through Christian media, staying up late planning broadcasts that would touch people's hearts. They didn't have a lot back then, but they had faith and a mission that felt clear. Now Joni was surrounded by the success they had built, but it felt hollow, like the mission had gotten buried under the pressure of keeping it all going. At home, the tension didn't leave. Her children, who had always been a part of the ministry, were struggling to navigate their own roles in the family and in Daystar. Jonathan especially found himself caught between supporting his mother and feeling the responsibility to protect the integrity of the ministry for the future. Conversations turned into arguments, with voices rising and tears falling, as they all tried to figure out how to hold on to the family and the ministry without losing themselves in the process. Late at night, Joni would walk the empty halls of the building, praying under her breath, asking God to show her what to do. She wanted to fight for Daystar, to prove to everyone that she was still the leader God had called her to be, but she couldn't ignore the reality that something needed to change. The whispers had grown into a loud truth. Daystar could not move forward the same way it had before. Supporters and critics alike were waiting to see what Joni would do. Some called for her to step down, to let new leadership take over and bring fresh vision to Daystar. Others pleaded with her to stay strong, to show the world that she wouldn't back down in the face of accusations, that she could lead the ministry through the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Joni found herself torn between those voices. Part of her wanted to hold on, to fight, to show that she was not the woman being described in rumors and reports. But another part of her felt tired, longing for peace, wondering if letting go was not a sign of failure, but an act of faith. She thought of Marcus, of how he would pray before every decision, how he would remind her that their calling was never about them, but about reaching people with the love of Jesus. One morning, as the sun rose over the quiet parking lot, Joni sat at her desk with tears in her eyes. She opened her Bible, letting the pages fall open to a verse that had carried her through many storms before. "Be still, and know that I am God." The words hit her differently this time. They didn't feel like a call to keep fighting in her own strength, but like a call to surrender, to trust God, even when it meant stepping back. Joni began to pray, honestly, for the first time in a long time, without trying to sound strong or put together. She admitted her fear, her pride, her desire to control, and her longing to see Daystar return to its mission without the shadows of scandal and division. She asked God to guide her, to show her what needed to change, even if it meant letting go of the role she had held for so long. The next days were some of the hardest of her life. She met with her children, staff, and trusted advisors, sharing her heart openly, admitting where she had fallen short, and expressing her desire to see Daystar healed and refocused on its mission. Some cried with her. Others sat quietly, letting the weight of her words sink in. For the first time in a long time, it felt like walls were coming down, and real conversations were happening. Joni decided to take a step back from daily leadership, allowing a trusted team to take on more responsibility while she focused on seeking God's direction and rebuilding relationships that had been strained. She didn't leave Daystar completely, but she allowed herself to rest, to find healing, and to focus on her faith instead of her image. The viewers too felt the shift. In a public broadcast, Joni shared her decision, not with polished words but with vulnerability, acknowledging the pain of the past season and asking for forgiveness where she had fallen short. She thanked viewers for their support and prayers, expressing hope that Daystar would come out of this season stronger, more focused on serving people and spreading the message of Jesus. It was a turning point not only for Joni, but for Daystar itself. The ministry began to rebuild trust with viewers and partners, prioritizing transparency, accountability, and a renewed focus on faith over fame. Staff who had felt discouraged began to find hope again, seeing that change was possible and that the mission was bigger than any one person. Joni continued to pray, to heal, and to trust that God was not done with her or with Daystar. The season was painful, but it became a reminder that God's work is never about personal kingdoms, but about His kingdom. And sometimes the bravest thing a leader can do is to step back and let God lead. This turning point became the foundation for a new chapter, one marked by humility, honesty, and the hope that Daystar's best days were still ahead.